What's for dinner? Fish soup. If you want to see how I make it, keep watching. If we're just meeting, I'm Denise Jordan, and I teach traditional homemaking for today's homemaker. So if you want to learn more about the art and science of homemaking, subscribe and double tap that little bell icon so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Okay, let's talk about fish soup. My husband brought home a mess of fish, and when he cleaned them and filleted them, we had all of these fish scraps left over. And I took a look at this and I thought, there is a lot of meat left on these fish carcasses. And I thought, as I try to move to a no-waste kitchen, what can I do with all of this? Because like I said, there's a lot of meat here. So I decided that I would make fish soup. And one of the things that you do need when you make fish soup is fish heads. Well, I got plenty of those too. So I'm going to make fish soup, Caribbean style fish soup, but not quite as hot. But the first thing I need to do is to make some fish broth. So I will make fish bone broth using this fish. And I've got about 5 pounds here. So I'll get the bone broth started and then we'll make the soup. So let me get this stock pot. I'm going to sit it here on this little stovetop burner. And I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm going to let that heat up. And then while that's heating up, I'll tell you what I'm going to use to make my broth for the fish soup. So, just like I make bone broth all the time, I always use a little bit of carrot. And I've got about 2 carrots here, and they're just kind of roughly chopped up. I've got 2 stalks of celery, or maybe 3 stalks of celery, I don't remember now. Again, roughly chopped. And they're the base for the broth. And then, of course, I've got about 2 teaspoons of black peppercorn. I always use 1 or 2 bay leaves. And then I've also got some vinegar. And this is some of my homemade vinegar that I made at one time. And there's only about a tablespoon of vinegar with about 1/2 to 3/4 cups of water, because since the fish broth only takes about 45 minutes to make the broth, I didn't want it to have too vinegary a taste, if that's even a word. But the 45 minutes that it takes to make the fish broth is not enough time for all the vinegar flavor to cook out. So that's why I diluted it. Now, I learned how to make fish broth from my friend Mary at Mary's Nest. And if you've not seen her channel, I'll link it below. She's amazing. But she typically uses apple cider vinegar for her broth. Well, I don't have any, but I do have some vinegar that I made earlier in the season, and I'll just go with that. And I've also got a couple of onions, just pretty much just sliced up. And what I'm going to do is put my vegetables in the bottom of the pot. And I'm going to put a little heat on them because I want them just to kind of start to cook just a little bit. And what these vegetables will do is they will make a layer or a bed for the fish. And I've got my heat set on medium heat. And then once the vegetables start to cook down just a little bit, then I will lay the fish carcass on top of the veggies, and then I will add my black peppercorns and my vinegar and my baby. So while I'm waiting for that to cook down, let me just show you a little bit about my fish carcass. So this is how my husband tends to fillet his fish. He takes the meat off in some kind of a, I don't know, with an electric knife in a nice little sheath, and that's what he typically eats. And we have always thrown this out. So as I think more and more about a no-waste kitchen and being more frugal, I realize I'm really throwing away some good stuff. And then the fish heads are really good because they provide a lot of the cartilage that kind of helps to make the broth more gelatinous. Now, why do I care if the broth is gelatinous? Well, I'm only going to use about 8 or 9 cups of broth to make the fish soup. So the rest of the broth I'm going to strain out very nicely, and then I'm going to put it in canning jars and put it in the freezer. So I want to get as rich a base for this broth as I can. So that's why I'm going through all the trouble of using my onions and celery and carrots and my bay leaves and all the things that I normally do to make fish broth, because I know I'm going to have more broth than I need for this recipe of fish soup. So once I add the fish, I'm going to add some water just to cover, and then I will let it kind of simmer, I'll say, on a high heat for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'll skim off any impurities, and then once that's done, I'll strain all of this out, and then I will take 8 cups of the fish broth to begin the base for the soup. And I'll show you what we're going to need to actually make the soup when we're ready to start that piece, so just bear with me. I do have a video series on how to make bone broth, including the tutorial on how to make fish broth. So if you want to check that out, I will link that above with an iCard and in the description box below. So I want you to take a look at how my husband prepared the fish so that I can make this fish bone broth. So he's removed the gills. You have to take the gills off because the gills leave kind of an odd flavor in the broth. So you want to make sure you take those off, and it makes the broth a little bit more gelatinous. And then here you can see the carcass of this particular fish. And he usually catches perch, bass, crappie, and bluegill. Those are the kinds of fish that he likes to fish for. I always say my husband always brings home dinner, but we've been throwing this out, and this could be a dinner within itself. So thank you, Mary, for encouraging me to transition more to a no-waste kitchen. And when we think about those traditional homemakers, they didn't waste any food. They used what they had. They didn't buy a lot of processed stuff. They had to use what they had. And just to share a story with you, I have a friend who went to school with me, and she was from Chile. And I remember asking her, what's the most interesting thing to you about America? And she said, the garbage. And I'm like, the garbage? And she said, yes, in Chile there is none because we eat everything. And I think about her from time to time when I'm being wasteful. So it's been over 40 years since I've seen her, but I think about her comments. So I'm trying to be less wasteful and a better steward of my resources. So these have started to kind of soften a little bit. So now I'm going to put the fish carcass on top of the veggies. And one of the things that I did, if you kind of look behind me, I've got a pot on the stove behind me of boiling water so that I can pour the boiling water in so it won't take us long for this to heat up. This is a lot of fish. It will make a lot of broth. So I've got all of my seasonings in for my fish bone broth. I've got in my peppercorns, my bay leaf, and I've not put in my vinegar yet. Let me go ahead and do that, and I'm going to put it right down into the pot. So now that all the spices are in the pot, the black peppercorns, the bay leaf, the vinegar, the carrots, the onions, the celery, all of that, they've been sauteed. I layered the fish bones on top of the veggies, which cooked until they were a little bit softened. And now I'm going to put the lid on and just sweat these fish bones. That means I'm going to just let them steam for about 10 to 15 minutes so that the cartilage can kind of start to come apart, and we'll just go from there. So about 15 minutes I'll let it do that, and while this is doing that, I'll be getting my vegetables ready for the fish soup. So here's what it looks like after it's been steaming for about 10 minutes. You can see where the meat is starting to cook a little bit and kind of break away from the bone. So now I will add my water just to cover, and I'm adding the water that I had on the stove. I brought this water to a boil earlier and then just kept it simmering. So now I've got my water in my stock pot. I'm going to bring it to a boil and then turn it down to a high simmer. So now I'm going to let this cook for about the next 30 minutes. I'm going to let it come to a high simmer and then just let it cook gently. The fish bone broth doesn't take a long time to cook. And if you let it cook too long, it can get kind of an off-putting flavor in it. So this is probably only going to take about 30 to 40 minutes. And then once it's where it needs to be, I'll strain everything out while I prepare to make the soup. So we'll let this do its thing and then we'll come back. One of the things that I have to do is skim off the impurities as they rise to the top. That's that white little cloudy stuff you see floating on top of the broth. Okay, so now my fish bone broth is done. So I'm going to get it strained out and then I'm going to set aside 1 gallon or 8 cups of bone broth to make the fish soup. And I'll put the rest aside and I will strain that out and then decant it into my jars and put it in the freezer for later use if there's any left over, which I imagine there will be. So let's go ahead and get this strained out. Now I've got a pretty fine strainer right here. I'm going to put it inside here and then put that there so we can see what's actually going in there. And since this first set of broth is going to go into the soup, it doesn't have to be perfectly clear. And one of the things I might have forgot to mention was when my husband processes the fish, he will fillet them, clean them, fillet them, and then use some kind of a salt and water process. And then he packs the fillets into freezer bags and gets his freezer ready for the winter. He's trying to stock up on fresh fish for the winter. So when I prepare to make this fish soup, this fish broth first, and then secondly the fish soup, I clean the fish. I rinse them really well in warm water, and then I rinse them again in lemon water, just to make sure that I got any impurities off of the fish. And as you can see, I've already got a good 8 cups. Look at that. Isn't that a delicious golden color? I want to just go ahead and put my 8 cups of broth in this pot. I'm going to set it back on the stove. And then I'll go ahead and get the rest of this broth strained out. And I'll get it strained out and set aside and deal with the rest of it later. All right, so now let's put this soup together. As you've already seen, I've got 8 cups of fish stock, or shall I say fish bone broth, right here in this pot. And now I'm going to add my veggies, those things that make soup a soup. So I've got 2 ears of corn, and I've got the corn cut into about 2-inch rounds. And then I've got 2 carrots. So I've got about, a cup of roughly chopped carrots. Over here I've got 4 green onions or 4 scallions, and I just chopped them up. So we'll go ahead and add these to our pot. It's going to make you think of one of those New England crab boils. We're also going to add 2 cloves of garlic, again roughly chopped. Now the thing that gives it its Caribbean flair is going to be these 2 sweet potatoes. And the sweet potatoes are cut in about 1-inch pieces. So there's 2 sweet potatoes cut up in about 1-inch pieces. And then 2 white potatoes, again cut up in about 1-inch pieces. And then I've got about a 1/2 cup, 3/4 cup of green beans. I would use okra, but I'm out. And I did send the hubby to the store. He went to 2 different stores and there was no okra to be found, frozen or fresh. So I'm swapping out the okra for the green beans. So we'll get those in. And then the piece de resistance is banana. Yes, there are 4 chopped green bananas that go in here as well. So that's your Caribbean style. So I'll give those a stir. Now let's talk about seasonings. First of all, I'm going to put in some cracked black pepper. And there'll probably be about, maybe a 1/2 teaspoon of cracked black pepper. Even though I'm making this Caribbean style, I don't like a lot of heat. So I'm not going to make it too hot. So about 1/2 teaspoon of cracked black pepper. However, I do like flavor, so I'm going to add a couple dollops of Heinz chili sauce. And that will replace the hot peppers or red chili peppers that people may like to use in that. As well as a packet of Goya seasoning mix, your Saison Goya seasoning mix. I'm going to add a packet of that. And it has great flavor. And again, I'm trying to get that Caribbean flair without all the heat. And then I'll add, just a dash or 2 of red pepper flakes, crushed red pepper flakes. I need a teaspoon of salt. So I've got some fine sea salt. And then 4 sprigs of fresh thyme. And I got those from my herb pot. So I'm going to strip the leaves off the stem. You just hold the stem upright and just kind of pull down and the leaves just kind of fall off. And when we talk about being a traditional homemaker, one of the things that traditional homemakers had was they usually had a little herb pot, herb garden somewhere close at hand. All right, so now I'm going to give this a stir and I'm going to bring this to a boil. And then once it comes to a boil, I'm going to turn it down to medium and then just kind of let it simmer for about 40 minutes, long enough for the potatoes to become tender. So I'll let you see what this is looking like right now. Look how bright and colorful that is. Isn't it beautiful? Just absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to let it do its thing for about the next 30 to 40 minutes and then I'll come back and we'll add the fish. Well, this fish soup is smelling absolutely amazing and it looks like it is done. So full disclosure, one of the things that I learned is that whereas those panfish that my husband brought home, the perch, the crappie, the bluegill, make great fish broth, by the time the meat has been cooked off of the carcass, you can barely distinguish it from the bone. So we did not use that meat to put in here. So what my husband did was he steamed some catfish, and that's the fish that is going into our soup now that it's done. Now I had to cook the soup with the veggies, the broth, that kind of thing until the potatoes were tender. And now that the potatoes are tender, the corn is cooked, I can add the fish. And I just need to let it just simmer for about, maybe 5 minutes, just so the flavors can marry together. And then I can plate it up. So moving forward, if you want to make fish soup, you probably want to use those fish that are really large, that have a large carcass. That way when you take the carcass out, the meat just kind of somewhat falls off the bone. Otherwise, if you're using fish like I did, like the hubby brings home when he's out fishing, and then we've got this carcass of all these fish, that makes a great fish broth to use as your base. And you can use that for your 8 cups of broth to start your fish, and then steam or bake some other fish that you actually lay on top in the soup itself. Now, one other thing I want to share with you as I grab a little taste for myself is that typically in a Caribbean fish soup, a Jamaican fish soup, they will put okra in. But as I said earlier, I couldn't locate any okra, so there's no okra in here. I swapped out the okra for green beans. The okra will cause the soup to thicken just a little bit more. So since I didn't have the okra for the thickening, I did add maybe 2 tablespoons of mashed potatoes and just sprinkle that around, and that thickens up the broth just a little bit. You could probably also use a little cornstarch, but I thought the mashed potatoes would be a little bit more hearty. All right, so now let's give this a taste. So I've got a little bit of fish, a little bit of the banana, and a little bit of the sweet potato on the spoon. It's really good. It has a nice light flavor, a natural sweetness that comes through with the banana and the sweet potato. And this tastes absolutely delicious. So I'm going to get this plated up and then we'll have dinner. But here's my question for you. Are you considering moving to a no-waste kitchen? Are there some things that you're discarding that maybe could be put to good use? Like maybe some veggie scraps or bone scraps for bone broth, or fish carcass for fish broth? Tell me in the comment section below. And just so you know, I've raised 3 children and I have managed a home for more than 45 years. So if you want to learn more about the art and science of homemaking, subscribe. I would love to have you as a member of the TNT community. In the meantime, this is Denise Jordan saying you are not done yet. Check out the link in the description box below so that you can see my video on how to make fish broth and how to make chicken broth. I'll see you next time.